Good evening. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist on November 4th, 2024. Today, on the eve of Election Day in the United States, the Toronto Star, one of Canada's most widely read newspapers, published an article titled, "Help Kamala Harris by Dropping Out of Presidential Race, Elizabeth May Urges U.S. Green Party Leader." For those of you who don't know Elizabeth May, she's the current leader of the Green Party of Canada. And except for a brief period from late 2019 to 2022, she has been leader of the Green Party since 2006. Of the five party leaders who currently sit in Canada's parliament, she's by far the longest serving leader. Electorally speaking, however, Elizabeth May is also the least successful of the sitting leaders. The Green Party has only two of Parliament's 338 seats. It's never had more than 3 seats in its entire history. Current polls suggest that if a federal election were held today in Canada, the Green Party would win no more than 2 seats. On November 1st, only 4 days before the US presidential election, May told the Toronto Star that a second Trump presidency would present a catastrophic threat to climate policy, women's rights, democracy, and world peace, as she broke from Canadian political convention, and here I'm quoting from the Star, by putting her full-throated support behind the Democratic candidate just days before the highly contested presidential election, in which votes for Jill Stein in battleground states could make a difference. In an interview with the Star, Elizabeth May said of Jill Stein, "We know you hate Democrats, we know that, but this is a planetary concern." Now, this is all quite odd given Elizabeth May's record on strategic voting. In the 2015 election, when there was a heavy push among progressives to vote for Justin Trudeau's Liberals in order to defeat arch neocon Stephen Harper, Elizabeth May said this about strategic voting, quote, "That's slaughtering us. It's disastrous. In a democracy, you should cast your ballot for what you want," close quote. Now with me to discuss all of this is none other than Dr. Jill Stein. Dr. Stein, thank you for joining me today on what must be surely a very busy time for you.
Yes, it is. We're en route from LA to Detroit, and in fact to Dearborn, the center really of the resistance in this election. So yeah, it's a very busy and very exciting time, in fact. And thank you for taking time, Dimitri.
Well, let's jump into it because I know you have a plane to catch. So before we get into the substance of Elizabeth May's statements, I'm curious to know, did Miss May, as far as you know, attempt to speak with you privately before she went public with her exhortations?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't believe she has ever sought contact with me. And, you know, she has taken some very divergent positions on things and been quite critical of me and the US Greens, but there has never been any effort to communicate.
Well, let's start with one of her arguments. I think it's fair to say that a premise of her argument overall is that the voters who would vote for you will switch their votes to Kamala Harris if you pull out. Now, based on the evidence, do you think there's truth to that implicit assertion?
That is a very tone-deaf, out-of-touch assertion, because it's been made very clear. You know, there's a whole organization called Abandon Harris. It was Abandon Biden before it was Abandon Harris. It's been around for, you know, most of the election, and well, certainly since since the genocide broke out. And in no uncertain terms, most Muslim voters and Arab American voters are not going to vote for Kamala Harris. And the question in their minds is whether they will vote for Donald Trump or whether they will vote for us. And in fact, most recent polls, cited both by Newsweek and by Breaking Points, the independent podcast, both of them cited 2 different polls that in fact show that we appear to be drawing, if we're drawing voters from any candidate, it's from Trump at this point and not from Kamala Harris. But overwhelmingly, you know, the vote has been lost by Kamala Harris, and she does not want to address that concern. Her preference is to simply smear myself and Greens. There was a major article in Time magazine like 2 days ago showing that the Democrats, in fact, are spending about 10 times our entire budget, our entire campaign budget. They are spending an order of magnitude greater simply to conduct a smear campaign against us, or a series of smear campaigns. And before that, they proudly announced that they had hired an army of lawyers in order to throw us off the ballot. So rather than actually addressing the substance of the concern of voters who have walked away from the party, their main strategy is to simply smear opposition candidates, which is to say smear candidates who are we are the only anti-genocide choice that actually has a pathway to the White House in this election, and which is on the ballot to truly, challenge empire and this genocide. So it's so wrongheaded and extremely unstrategic and out of touch for, Elizabeth May to be attempting to influence US elections here, really knowing apparently not very much about what's actually going on here.
I'm glad you mentioned the concept of influencing US elections. She's, of course, not the only Green Party personality who has called on you to withdraw. I understand that 17 European Green parties have also called on you to withdraw. And also the British and US press reported last month that the UK Labour Party volunteers are helping the Kamala Harris campaign. UK's Labour Party and all of these Green parties, including Elizabeth May's, have complained relentlessly about alleged foreign interference in the domestic politics of their countries. They constantly point the finger at Russia and China for what their claim is interference in their elections. Do you think that their complaints about foreign interference can be reconciled with their approach to your candidacy in this election?
No, and I wasn't aware of, the efforts of the UK Labour Party to help, to help Kamala Harris's campaign. That's very interesting, and if they're concerned about foreign interference, then they ought to be concerned, especially about AIPAC and the buying of, of our elections in a very explicit way. There's been a terrific investigative report actually done by Lee Fang of The Intercept, detailing the flow of money actually from the Knesset to nonprofit organizations in this country, which are then, pushing, and this is outside of AIPAC. These are groups that are changing actually regulations and laws and policies at the level of the colleges and the universities, resulting in, an absolute assault on the rights of free speech, the right to demonstrate, the right to protest on our campuses as well. So there is a lot of influence to be had right now, which far exceeds, these Russian memes, which had very little to do content-wise and no demonstrable effect, actually, and were a tiny drop in the bucket of, the larger social media campaigns that were actually being conducted. So, and Elizabeth May herself had complained about my alleged, my accused role in Russiagate, which was essentially disproven by the Senate Intelligence Committee. So while she's gone on record disapproving of my role allegedly, which was false, pure smear campaign, she's expressed concern about Russian interference, but doesn't hesitate to, assert influence herself, or express concern about Israel's truly impactful, huge effect on the race, spending $100 million and taking out many of the opponents who actually stand up against, against a free ride for Israel and unlimited donations to the government of Israel, or shall I say, unlimited spending by the US Congress, which results in unlimited donations effectively to the state of Israel to conduct its horrific genocide.
On that subject, Elizabeth May says that Trump's election would threaten democracy and world peace. I think it's fair that the implication she's making is that Kamala Harris will protect democracy and world peace. What do you say to that, Jill?
It's another extremely uninformed and tone-deaf assertion. World peace. How about this expanding war? to protect Israel's genocidal assault on Palestine now. You know, there's a very extremely dangerous war as Israel expands its assault into the West Bank, into Lebanon, with bombing campaigns now against Yemen and Syria, talk of regime change by Israel in Syria, and this impending war with Iran, which Bibi Netanyahu has been trying to drag the world into, and especially the US. Effectively, the baton for commander-in-chief has been handed over to Bibi Netanyahu. So he gets to do whatever he wants and drag the US into it, and then be rewarded with unlimited funding and boots on the ground. And, you know, US servicemen and women, 5,000 with each of 2 aircraft carriers right now, one parked off the coast of Iran, the other one off the coast of Gaza. And now we're hearing about, you know, aircraft that are also coming in to help assist in Israel's defense. So talk about world peace. You know, it is absolutely going down the tubes in a way that's reminiscent of World War I, which could be extremely explosive because you have Iran basically in a military alliance with Russia, and you have Israel discussing its intention to actually bomb the nuclear facilities in Iran, which is, last I saw, bombing a nuclear power plant is like basically detonating a nuclear weapon. Unbelievably dangerous, and could easily trigger, you know, a massive and very dangerous expansion of this war and bring Russia into it. At a time, you know, when the US draft, the military draft has been reestablished. And in fact, people, men between the ages of 18 and 25 are now being registered without their knowledge or their consent. They are actually being registered for the draft, and the draft knows where to find you. And, you know, we could wind up paying here, not only in dollars, but also in blood. You know, at a time when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, their administration has actually promised boots on the ground without specifying any limits to that, that if Israel needs further assistance, that boots on the ground are in the target hairs. That's in addition to another 100 people that were just sent there last week to basically staff this new higher powered missile defense system, the so-called THAAD system. So, you know, this is World War III in the making here, and potentially going nuclear. So if we're going to talk about immediate threats to world peace, this is exactly what's going on under Kamala Harris. And remember, she also said that under her administration, the US would have the most lethal military force in the world. So, you know, so much for Elizabeth May's conclusions here. That's not to say Donald Trump is a reliable alternative, which is exactly why it's really important that we stand up and offer what the American people are absolutely clamoring for right now. That is, you know, a political campaign that actually presents prospects of peace and has a peace plan and an immediate plan to end that genocide with a simple phone call, which is all that it would take. This is what Ronald Reagan did to basically call the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Forces, back from Lebanon in 1982. Within 24 hours of that phone call, that series of massacres was over and done with, and that could be done here as well.
Let's focus on another existentially dangerous war, one for which you've taken considerable heat because you've departed from the orthodoxy on this war, and that's, of course, the war in Ukraine. The German Greens, who I think are arguably the most influential and powerful Green Party in the world because they are actually part of a government in a major Western country. They hold 2 key portfolios, the Ministry of Finance and the Defense Ministry. I'm sorry, the Foreign Ministry. And they have been, I think, unhesitatingly supportive of arming Ukraine and the sanctions and so forth. And there was, of course, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which, according to legendary journalist Seymour Hersh, quoting inside sources, was orchestrated by the Biden administration, was quite possibly one of the worst environmental crimes of modern history. And the Greens seem not even remotely interested in Germany and doing anything about that, holding anybody seriously accountable. What, in a nutshell, Jill, is your position on the Ukraine war? I want just to ensure that our audience isn't listening to what's being said about your position, but understands very clearly what it actually is.
So this war did not begin in 2022. These hostilities certainly began in 2014 with the US-backed coup orchestrated by Victoria Nuland in the famous leaked phone call, where she was basically calling the shots on who the next leadership would be in Ukraine. And it's common knowledge that the US and NATO had promised way back at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union that in exchange for allowing Germany to reunite, that the US would and NATO would not move one step further to the east. And what is going on there right now, just to cut to the chase, it's essentially the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. And we should understand what that was about, because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Russia was bringing its nuclear missiles to Cuba. We were we went ballistic, no pun intended there, about having nuclear weapons on our border. We had launched the airplanes, the bombers containing the nuclear bombs. We were that, outraged about it. So what Russia is doing is essentially the same thing, because after years and years of attempting to negotiate simply to achieve neutrality on this critical border over which that is the Ukraine-Russia border, over which Russia has been invaded many times over history, and in the Second World War lost some 27 million, Russian people in the course of that war, and particularly with the invasion of Russia. So Russia is touchy about its border in the same way that the US is touchy about its border, and there are already NATO missiles lining that border, not in Ukraine, but in other areas, and these missiles are nuclear compatible. And what that means is that overnight, the warheads can be swapped out. So being nuclear compatible essentially amounts to having nuclear missiles on the border. So, this is why Russia attempted to negotiate, and in fact did negotiate in good faith and achieved an agreement with Zelensky in February of 2022, just very shortly after the war began. There was a peace deal to end the war, in which Russia offered a lot of leeway. Russia gave on many issues, including postponing any decision about the ultimate disposition of Crimea. Russia was not going to absorb the eastern provinces. So Russia actually negotiated in good faith, as did Ukraine. And then the US and the UK came in and basically broke it up. So this is a tragic war. Yes, Putin, it was a criminal invasion when he invaded. However, it was a very provoked invasion, which he had attempted to avoid. And so Ukraine is paying the price here. And what is happening is exactly what anyone informed about Ukraine understood would happen. That is, this is critical territory to Russia. This is an existential threat. They are not backing off. And, Ukraine is basically being destroyed, and they are now being, defeated as well. The tide has really turned. The efforts that the US tries to make to, make it look like, the tide has turned, has never turned the tide. And, it's arguably hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have been killed or severely injured. So this is a disaster, and the US needs to stop throwing fuel on the fire for the purpose, as actually admitted by our Secretary of Defense, for the purpose of basically bleeding Russia's resources.
Right. One thing I want to add as a footnote too, I think it's an excellent analogy, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the current situation, except that and I forget to do this often myself, prior to the time that the Castro government invited the Soviets to bring nuclear weapons onto Cuban soil, the US government tried repeatedly to kill Fidel Castro and overthrow his government. In this situation, it wasn't the Russians who overthrew Yanukovych in 2014. It was the West there too that engaged in or orchestrated violent regime change. So the Ukrainians didn't even have the same kind of
Mhm. Mhm.
justification for inviting a foreign power to bring nuclear weapons onto its soil. But in any event, otherwise, I think
Yes.
we're
And add to that, the missiles that the US had placed in Turkey, which basically had Russia in the target hairs. So, there were many mitigating circumstances there, but to the credit of both JFK and Khrushchev, they had, against the advice of their advisors, they insisted on negotiating. If only we had such wisdom, in our warmongering, war criminal leadership right now, and their recklessness here, both in Ukraine as well as, you know, where things are accelerating in Ukraine in the same way that we're going up the escalation ladder in the Middle East, with US and Israel really leading the way. The US is leading the way as well. The US and NATO are leading the way in up the escalation ladder, with these long-range missiles now from the US and NATO, which are being used by Ukraine with permission to, attack territory inside of Russia. So this is unbelievably dangerous, and our so-called leadership is clueless about nuclear weapons, because they frequently say, oh, but we won't worry about that because if we have a nuclear war, it's over there. Well, the truth is, it doesn't matter. Any nuclear war is basically global, because the radiation is local, the blast is local, although it gets carried beyond local by weather patterns, but the debris goes up into the upper atmosphere and it stays there. So when you see that mushroom cloud, that is a conveyor belt taking debris into the upper atmosphere where it does not weather down, and it will be there for decades, basically interfering with sunlight. So,
mm,
as nuclear blasts go off, we are all put at risk for a nuclear winter. So this is absolutely insane. The net weapons that are referred to as tactical, oh, don't worry about them, they're just tactical nukes. Tactical nukes include within their range the size of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. That's what's called a tactical nuke, about which our leadership is so casual, and we are just plunging headlong, into potential nuclear war right now.
mhm.
So, and this is happening under Kamala Harris, who has been, you know, uh, at least as aggressive and arguably even more aggressive than Donald Trump, though he was hardly a peace president. He was not a peace president, and he encouraged, he escalated in minor ways, but the Biden-Harris, administration is escalating in just devastating major ways. So this is extremely dangerous, and to say that we need to elect Kamala Harris, who's bringing, she's campaigning with Dick Cheney's daughter. Dick Cheney has endorsed this campaign, is trying to get George Bush on board as well. We have really arguably the biggest war criminals that walk the earth today supporting the Kamala Harris administration. She cannot define any difference between herself and Joe Biden, and has promised to bring Republicans. Oh, except for this, she has promised to bring Republicans into her cabinet and to have a bipartisan advisory board. This is the merger of the neoliberals and the neocons, and the biggest warmongers in US history are now all backing the Kamala Harris campaign. So do not pretend for a minute that this is a pathway to peace. The
Yeah, no,
only pathway to peace is through our campaign.
absolutely. And we could also talk about the fact that, if you could make a pretty powerful argument that Bush and Cheney stole the 2000 election. So the idea that they're supporting Kamala Harris because they're champions of democracy doesn't seem particularly persuasive to those of us who remember the history. Um, I want to talk to you about climate, because Elizabeth May alluded to that as well. She talked about there being a planetary emergency, and she clearly implied that our best hope for US government policy that is responsible from a climate crisis perspective is Kamala Harris. What, in fact, how would you summarize the Democratic Party record on the climate crisis over the past 20 years under Obama, under Biden, and now, well, those two administrations in particular?
Yeah, so Elizabeth May is dutifully, repeating the propaganda of the Democratic Party. But if you actually look at the record, fossil fuel emissions skyrocketed far more under the Biden campaign than it did under the Trump campaign before it. And same is true for Barack Obama relative to George Bush. It's been the Democrats who really accelerated climate emissions. And if you read the Inflation Reduction Act, contrary to the propaganda about it, it is a major fossil fuels bill. Fossil fuels far and away above renewable energy. Fossil fuels and nuclear for that matter, but just focusing on fossil fuels for the moment. Here's an example of this. And, this kind of gets to the heart of the matter. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, it mandates that 60 million acres of offshore waters and 2 million acres of public lands onshore have to be auctioned off for fossil fuel extraction every year before any major renewable project can be built. So what the Inflation Reduction Act does is provide for window dressing. It provides for some green jobs, that's great. It provides for some incentives for electric vehicles, but that doesn't do what the climate needs. The climate needs for fossil fuels to be phased out fast. And, the Green New Deal that we advocate calls for a 10-year phase out and an immediate ban on all fossil fuel infrastructure. Yet the Inflation Reduction Act is massively ramping up fossil fuel production. Now, it happens that much of this through the liquid natural gas export facilities, which went ballistic after the Nord Stream pipeline was destroyed, most likely by our government in the US here, because Joe Biden had promised, when he was asked what would the retribution be, and he was like, well, trust me, we have ways. He promised that this would happen, and in fact it did happen. And when it did, this was a bonanza for US natural gas and for US fossil fuels. And so after Nord Stream, there was a huge increase in the planning and the development for liquid natural gas export facilities, which are extremely fossil fuel intensive and very, very powerful emitters of greenhouse gas. And there's some 22 of them that are basically in the works right now. A few were permitted under Trump, but for the most part, they've been permitted under Biden. And what does this amount to? According to the Sierra Club, these 22 new LNG plants, which are also extremely destructive to native populations, to low-income populations along the coast, very destructive to coastlines and to the oceans. And they're fed by liquid natural gas pipelines that are generally putting indigenous territory at risk and destroying sacred sites and all the rest. But if you look at, so what is the fossil fuel imprint of this? It is actually the equivalent of building over 500 new coal plants, and the overall impact basically knocks back all progress on fossil fuel reductions. It knocks us back to the year 2005. So it essentially eliminates 20 years of progress in reducing fossil fuel emissions from the US. So, that's the reality. It's not the propaganda. And, it's just such a sad commentary on the Green parties in Europe and, leaders like Elizabeth May, that they go no farther than the propaganda of the Democratic Party. They're not actually looking at a real assessment. They're not getting their news. They must be getting their news from MSNBC. They're certainly not getting it from, independent, analysts and independent news sources. It's just shameful that this is really driving the climate crisis over the cliff for them to be promoting the Harris-Biden approach to climate. And Kamala Harris herself brags about how she cast the tie vote to expand fracking. And I think that was actually with the Inflation Reduction Act, which expands fracking. This is supposed to be a climate bill. It's like, you have to be really ignorant about the climate to think that you can just balance out your renewables with your fossil fuels. And in this case, you're not even balancing them. You have to produce way more fossil fuels before you can do any renewables. And, it's like, how I would have thought Elizabeth May understood the basics, and Green parties, ought to understand the basics. Nature doesn't care about renewable energy. People care, but nature doesn't give, flying whatever, not at all. And in fact, what you have to do to address the climate problem is remove the fossil fuels. Doesn't matter how much renewables you do. And in both for Obama, his thing was all of the above. Oh, great, we're doing renewable energy, so we can balance that out with fossil fuels. You have to be really ignorant of all climate science to think that's the case. And, I'm just surprised that Greens anywhere don't know the reality of what's going on here.
And lastly, Jill, because I know you got to go, I do have to ask this question because it's quite important in this particular election, and that is the issue that Elizabeth May raised in her laundry list of reasons why people should vote for Kamala Harris. She mentioned, of course, reproductive rights. And obviously, the premise of her argument is that American women can expect that the Democratic Party will vigorously protect their reproductive rights, whereas the Republicans will sabotage them. And I saw an interesting post today on X from Margaret Kimberly, whom I follow carefully. And she attached a video clip from a speech that Obama gave when he was the president. And in the clip and her commentary, she noted that when Obama had the votes to enshrine into law Roe v. Wade, he did not do so. So what is the reality of the Democratic Party record under the Biden administration and the Obama administration when it comes to women's reproductive rights?
So they've had the power to codify Roe and protect women's reproductive rights for most of the last 60 years. And Barack Obama said, in campaigning that this would be the first thing he would do. But somehow the first thing he did was to bail out, the crooks on Wall Street and throw out millions of homeowners. And it became clear who he was working for, if you didn't already know, which we Greens, of course, were, well appraised of long in advance. But Obama and then Joe Biden also said that this would be the first thing that he would do. And in fact, the rules of the, of the veto power could have been modified so that you could ensure reproductive rights with simple majority and not even require the 2/3 majority in the Senate. So, and the Republicans, when they had the majority, they have modified the rules for overcoming the the 2/3 rule in some specific areas. So Democrats could have done this for most of the past 60 years. Whenever they were in power, they could have done this, and they chose not to, even when they had the 2/3 majority in the Senate. And in addition, the Democrats could fix this right now. They could have fixed this after Roe was repealed, and even before Roe was actually eliminated, when it was basically in the cards and people knew that this was coming, simply by building abortion clinics or reproductive health care clinics on federal land, that is, like military bases, which exist in every state. So the Democrats could have remedied this truly emergency situation in the blink of an eye if they wanted to. But they seem to like raising money on this issue, and they seem to like, just sort of blaming and shaming people who have left the Democratic Party behind. So, not to mention that this is all solvable with ranked choice voting. You won't have any, so-called spoiled election, nobody taking votes away from anybody else or causing unintended consequences with your vote. If you're voting for an underdog as your first choice and the underdog doesn't win in the first go around, then your vote is automatically reassigned to your second choice. So this is absolutely doable. Oh, and I'm getting the sign here. All right, great. We got to get to our gate in 2 minutes.
Okay.
But the point is that ranked choice voting would solve this. The Democrats not only don't support it, they actually fight against it with these fake ranked choice voting bills that, it's kind of a bait and switch. So, or they outright oppose the measures. So they have no one to blame for themselves. And besides, it's really it is a myth that third parties take votes away. You're supposed to compete for votes. That's what a democracy is. You're supposed to compete for votes. And furthermore, the numbers show and the polls show that for the most part, people who vote third party in the US are largely people who otherwise aren't voting. And who is that who's not voting? This is 1 out of every 3 eligible voters in this country did not vote in 2020 in the presidential race because they don't buy the zombie parties being rammed down our throats. So, this could be fixed. And furthermore, the accusation that we are stealing votes is wrong. People own their votes here in this country, and politicians do not own your vote. They have to earn your vote. They haven't earned them, and this is just smoke and mirrors to try to intimidate voters and to try to extort the vote. And shame on any Green who is, number one, supporting the warmongering candidates, supporting the genocide, failing to stand up against it, and actually supporting the destruction of the climate, which is arguably being conducted more vigorously by the Democrats than the Republicans. And finally, it's a Green value. Decentralized democracy and local democracy is a Green value. And for any Green leader to be advocating on behalf of the war machine to basically toss aside local democracy, it's not exactly a Green way to go.
I just want to conclude on a personal note, Jill. As you know, I ran to be a leader of the Green Party of Canada in 2020, and my view of the world is very much aligned with yours. And I know how hard that was. I personally experienced relentless attacks. And I can't imagine how much harder it is when you're running to be the president of the United States. What I endured was probably a trifle compared to what you've had to endure. And I just want to thank you. I want to thank you. And I know that the vast majority of people who watch my program would want me to express their gratitude for the fact that you ran. And we all wish you the very best tomorrow.
Thank you so much. And I feel like we're all kind of going to the mat right now in the face of genocide and everything else that's kind of in meltdown right now. And the outcome is absolutely amazing. What's happened in this country right now. We are at such a breaking point, and the political mobilization happening and that has actually taken place in the face of the genocide is amazing. And we have really strong partners now going forward for the long haul. So I wouldn't trade this for anything.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. Have a safe flight, and we wish you the very best for tomorrow.
Great. Thanks so much. As far as I'm concerned, we've already won, and we will continue to win. And we define what the win is, not the predators. We define that win, and we're doing great, and we're going to keep going. So look forward to talking to you again.
Take care. Take care, Jill.
Thanks, Dimitri.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.